Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Mike, we're both investors in the space. I'm at a financial fund called DFJ, and you're at GE. And so I would love to get a little bit of your background and perspective on how you got into GE Ventures and how GE Ventures thinks broadly about AI and your own focus within that. Big questions to start. Sorry.
Background, how I got there, what I think is interesting.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
So I've been an investor, a venture investor for 30 years, since last century, I like to say. And so I've been at institutional VC firms as well as led several corporate venture firms. How did I get to GE Ventures? The answer to that is it was about 5 or 6 years ago. I had an interaction with the people that eventually became GE Digital. And at the time, it was the most audacious thing I could see people trying to do in Silicon Valley. How do you take a company that was over 100 years old, an industrial heavy equipment manufacturer, and get it to take advantage and explore and exploit AI to create valuable outcomes for its customers. That seemed easy to say, but very difficult to believe that the GE culture could change the supertanker's direction a little bit. And so the last question is, what do I think is most interesting these days?
Right, so I think one of the fundamental questions here is industrial AI and AI as a whole is such a large topic. So maybe before we dive into specifically what's exciting for you, so we can talk a little bit about, we have how kind of journalism and the press covers AI broadly, and then we have what we in the industry actually determine are useful use cases. And so I guess the real question is, how would you, not necessarily define AI because it's just too generic of a question, but what within AI kind of keeps you up at night? What do you get excited about? What do you go search for?
Well, first remember, the other part of the answer I didn't give you is the reason I came to GE is that it was easy to be the smartest guy in the room about smartest investor about industrial AI, because the world of industrial software was still in the mid 20th century at that point.
Or because investors just aren't very informed.
Yeah, there weren't many investors at that time. Now there's more. So the industrial markets, the industrial software market is somewhat resembles enterprise software and the things that people are used to investing in, and the playbook kind of resembles, for investors, the playbook resembles enterprise SaaS software if you're lucky. But it's also a weird parallel universe where things are different and they tend to bite investors. So the customers are extremely conservative. And I can explain why, but the sales cycles are just a lot longer.
So that's actually a great point that I'd love to dig into a little bit. When I talk to AI startups that want to go after, whether it's predictive maintenance, something in the manufacturing space, something for oil and gas or wind turbines, they always want to go after the biggest, meatiest, hardest problems to solve, which also end up being kind of safety critical and business critical systems for large companies like GE. So on the customer side, how do we think about adoption in these spaces where there's willingness to look at innovation, but not a lot of willingness to take risk?
So how do I think about it as an investor, or how should startups think? It's tough is the short answer. The odds are stacked against. That's what I meant by the playbook is different. So a small startup trying to deal with a very conservative customer that is culturally not used to or really has an immune system response against dealing with small, innovative companies. Because most of the recipe for success for these large customers is don't break what is already working, don't fix what's already working, novelty is really not very interesting because it's usually associated with so much risk, it's not worth it. So the recipe for success for the startup requires extraordinary amount of domain awareness. What are the problems that this company faces? Not generically, but specifically. How do you quickly get them to relate to you and trust you? And then how do you conserve your cash over a much longer sales cycle? That's usually the advice I give startups that are, and investors really, that are pursuing some of these spaces, is that it requires a lot more patience. In some cases, the time between investment and exit is longer than most venture funds.
That's right.
So how do you work that? So you have to make sure you have very patient investors no matter where they come from is kind of rule number one.
It's a fair point, and we think about it a lot when we look at companies in this space, which is how do we keep them sufficiently capitalized to actually prove their value? Have you seen any of your own portfolio companies be particularly good at this in terms of finding the opportunities, whether, again, it's for predictive maintenance or anything else, that do get the kind of sink their teeth in early and start building viable businesses? Or
Sure.
Yeah, and how can you explain which ones have worked? Yeah.
I think almost every company set out with some general target direction in mind. And then they found that wasn't perfect, that they did a lot of discovery of who the customer really was. And in particular, the way that I see the most successful companies in my portfolio operating is they either quickly develop some way to qualify a prospect.
Right.
Or they run out of cash and burn out. It's sort of binary. So the way I judge progress in most of these companies is when they get to a very intellectually honest list of qualification questions, like, I'm abstracting this a little bit, but is digital transformation a critical issue for your company? Do you have a chief digital officer, which is kind of an indication that maybe they're serious about it? Does that person have a budget? Another really interesting one is, have one of your digital transformation efforts already failed? So do you understand both the sense of urgency and the cost of maybe not having planned it out too well? There's a series of about 10 or 14 questions the most sophisticated customers have, because the main goal is you don't have time to go down a blind alley and waste your time. You want to say no to the customer that seems like a really nice person, but you just don't have, they're never going to close. And you got to find the ones that actually are worth spending time on, because it's going to take a long time to convince even them to close the sale.
Right, so a takeaway is, if you're a startup looking in the industrial AI space, to kind of cull quickly from the customers who are just kicking the tires versus the ones who are actually willing to engage.
Yeah, that sounds easy. It's hard to know what the right questions are. But if you can, then you have a fighting chance. And I think that's why the successful companies, now I've got CEOs talking to each other, trying to compare notes, because it seems to be a similar pattern. And there are certain companies and certain executives in those companies that are safer to sell to than others.
Absolutely. To your earlier point of companies kind of running headlong into their own bias and flaming out in terms of capital before they've really built solutions that have great product market fit, how do you think about, well, we talked about this earlier, the kind of split between a more horizontal approach versus AI often requires very specific proprietary data sets, and a lot of institutional vertical knowledge is then required to build particularly useful systems. GE, both internally and in your investments, you guys have kind of gone across the board in both horizontal plays, like a Predix platform and others, and more vertical institutions. So how do you guys think about that space? What gets you excited to move in either direction? And are there specific areas that you think are better suited to horizontal solutions versus vertical? That was a lot of questions.
Yeah, wow,
I will rephrase. So horizontal versus vertical, what are you excited about?
Okay.
And how do you kind of pick
That's the question
winners?
I was going to answer anyway. Okay.
Great.
So I think horizontal,
It's early.
that's horizontal versus vertical, is a sort of allusion to the architecture or kind of problem that they're trying to address. And horizontal solutions are ones, at least the ones that we see, address the problem of acquiring lots of data from some places where you sense it, moving it to where you wished it was, because it's usually in some inconvenient place and form, doing something with it to make it, to prepare it and clean it up, to prepare it for something fun like machine learning, and then doing something monetizable and valuable with it that generates some interesting customer outcomes. Right. So the horizontal stuff is, we call it digital infrastructure because it's a fancy name for plumbing. And in the industrial world, there's an enormous amount of data. It's always in the wrong place. It's happening, it gets generated extremely fast. It's much less structured and far dirtier, and often the samples are incomplete, than the traditional stuff that Google and Facebook have to deal with. And so there's a lot of horizontal issues, just issues with the horizontal movement of data, so to speak. And we've been an active investor in there because there are companies that understand those specific issues with industrial data, and they solve productivity problems with it. What we were finding is that we just had too many, the problem wasn't scaling. As we had more and more projects, we could forecast that we'd need armies of professional services people to do the cleanup, the unfun, unsexy stuff that people don't talk about as far as AI goes. The vertical things are different because there the constraint in industrial is the requirement that you have access to domain expertise. So unlike digital first companies where it's been very straightforward to all the data has been digital from day one, it's relatively clean, the complexity of the problem is more straightforward. Like what sweater is this person looking for is different than a very complex industrial situation you've never seen before. So the vertical companies somehow figure out how to acquire and apply plain old machine learning expertise, but together with domain expertise. And their challenge is that there aren't a lot of old fart people that have domain expertise in the same zip code as people that have machine learning expertise. So it's hard to combine those two and get enough in the same company to pull off a value proposition.
That's right. The scientists versus the engineers are tough in the space. And I'm particularly curious to see how it plays out, whether we do end up with these horizontal data cleaning tools that are sufficiently valuable across these industries. I think we're running right up against kind of our 15, 20 minutes together. Okay, and so I want to look at our questions here from the audience.
There's some questions over there, too.
Oh, man, they're all over the place. So actually, I like this first question. Because I get asked this a lot, and so I'm curious for your perspective, is that, what are some forums in which people can kind of better connect? Well, this specifically asks about seed stage investors, but I would ask, how can people get in touch with you if they have interesting and exciting ideas in the space that they think are going to be relevant?
I'm apparently pretty easy to find because I received 3 business plans from MIT alumni this morning before I got in the car to drive up here. Between the GE earnings call and 7 o'clock is when I got them. So I'm Dolbec at ge.com. GE Ventures is headquartered in Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park. We have offices in Boston, Houston, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Tel Aviv. So we're where a lot of interesting stuff happens for the customers that we serve. As far as what forums should you connect with, we have an investment in a co-creation studio called The Hive in Palo Alto, and they do a tremendous, they produce an extraordinary number of events per month, usually 2 or 3. I don't know how they do it. So between The Hive is, I think, very good listener about industrial IoT issues. We've financed actually bought one company that came from them, but financed another one, and we're on the verge of financing another one. So I'd say they're plugged in, but they also are networkers, and they bring communities of interest together. Alchemist is another group. It's a startup accelerator focused here in the city. I'm not sure which geography we're talking about, so if you want to know specifically in some geo, talk to me afterwards. Awesome. Because there are different groups in Boston and elsewhere.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. It was
my pleasure. Thank you. This went much faster than I thought. So
it wasn't too painful?
No,
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
So for our next guest in the hot seat, we have a dear friend of mine, Kanu Gulati, who I hope is mic'd up. Awesome, because otherwise I'm just going out of order. So Kanu is a brilliant investor at Khosla Ventures. She recently joined the team there. And you have a fascinating technical background, so I was wondering if we could just open up with a little bit on your background, particularly your academic background, and how that drives your interest and passion in investing in and around AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here, Maryanna. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. So yeah, I got my master's and PhD in computer engineering focused on hardware acceleration. So NVIDIA, Intel funded a lot of my PhD, so I'm really grateful to these giant corporations. I then went and got a business degree from the wrong side of Charles, but trust me, ever since then I've been rectifying it. I spent time with the CSAIL lab and joined a startup immediately after my MBA called MapD. As employee number 2, spent some time with them. I then went and joined a seed fund here in the city, which is run by Mark Kortenberg, who was an MIT alum and on the investment committee at MIT. And now at my current role at Khosla, I've been leading investments out of the robotics labs, the design studios and media lab of MIT. So I'm trying to build more connections with MIT.
Oh, I'm with you on that.
But coming back to your question, because I've spent time on the research side and a lot of recent advancements in AI, in ML, AI is like a catch-all for everything, but recent advances in ML and deep learning do require some of the latest, bleeding edge research, and figuring out how you connect that to the business case is an important, it's an important skill to have and something I'm learning, and I try to work with entrepreneurs to figure that out. And that's always exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I feel you on wanting to build more MIT connections. I'm one of those MIT dropouts, so I kind of show up with my tail between my legs when I'm back on campus. So a question, and we've chatted about this before, is we're both at institutional financial funds, right? So our first job is to be stewards of the capital that we have the privilege to spend, and that means that our return profiles have to look a particular way. And so when I look at industrial AI, do you ever worry that some of the vertical niche applications, like AI for open pit mining or for some particular flare stack inspection, are just too small and too niche, and they don't kind of expand beyond their borders? Or is that just not that relevant from your perspective?
Actually, we don't worry. At the investment committees at KV, we've never worried that one of the niche verticals within industrial is too small. That's never the worry. There's lots of other challenges, some of them which Mike alluded to. But each of these verticals, whether it's manufacturing, it's construction, it's oil and gas, each of them have billions of dollars they spend just for operational efficiency or improving compliance or adding to their top line growth. So the market size is never a problem. It's more about how is this particular startup tracking or trying to retire some of the other risks which come in, which are different in industrial AI as opposed to for implementing AI-based solutions in other enterprises. And some of them could be just an adoption risk, like the skill gap of the staff on an underground mine is very different from a skill, say a company like Netflix is trying to adopt a new technology which is based on AI. Similarly, Mike mentioned this, the data is not ever in a clear, connected place. There are lots of different systems that run, a lot of different data sources that are getting generated, which are all noisy, not clean. Some of them are real-time streaming data. Some of them are from historians. Some of them are databases which you've internally put together. And some of these data just might be not accessible because of classified due to legal or financial issues. And there are all these other challenges in just aggregating this data or adoption of tech or just connectivity. For example, again, coming back to the underground mine, just lack of Wi-Fi,
Right.
or in certain cases where you have a lot of edge devices streaming a lot of data, there could be a limited bandwidth issue. So how are you thinking about all those other challenges? Those we are worried more about when investing in a startup in this area, much less about the market size.
So basically the way that you look at the world, if I can poorly summarize, is that adoption, in particular in some of these industrial industries, ends up being really tough because the larger environment is tough. And that's why we maybe have seen it lag slightly,
Yes.
or because these are safety critical systems. And it's interesting, right? Because we have like Google, which is absolutely running business critical AI, but you don't see as much of that in like the healthcare spaces or these industrials.
Yeah.
And so is it the environment, or is it truly like a reluctance in the market?
I think it's a combination. So the environment, obviously, you need a more robust solution. You need a clearer ROI, which is easily, can be gotten by the business units. But it's also, it takes longer for industrial AI to build trust in these applications. Now already more than 15% of Gmail's replies are auto response. We trust the system. We'll just respond and go on. We don't trust, even the autonomous trucks in our mining plants enough to just have them run everything on their own, because it takes time to build that trust, and in certain industries, that trust just takes a longer time.
Absolutely. You didn't text me yesterday saying that I can't harass you about some of your portfolio companies, so I'm going to take this opportunity to do so in a really public forum. So you guys have done a bunch of really interesting investments in and around AI, and one that I'm particularly curious about, mostly because the press noise was so loud, but also because I looked at this company and couldn't get comfort, is how do you guys think about, what is Vicarious doing? Because this was a really exciting company for a lot of people, really strong technical team, came in and basically said, we're going to do generalized AI, we're going to solve everybody's problems. Raised a bunch of capital from brilliant investors like Kanu. And then from my perspective, I've gone a little bit dark. Like, I haven't heard a lot coming out of them. So is this a timescale that we should expect from these companies? Have they not nailed the problems that they're going after? Or is it, is it square peg round hole? Or should we just all be a little bit more patient, to Mike's earlier point?
We are actually really excited about our investment in Vicarious, so happy to share more about it. And of course, this is stuff which they've already publicly shared. So what Vicarious is trying to do is, they try to distinguish between what they call as narrow AI, where a machine learning or a deep learning system is just even things like Google's AlphaGo, et cetera, is just trained to do one thing really well, versus what you mentioned, like more of a generalized AI, which with being data efficient on the training side, with very little training examples, they can learn more generalized tasks easily. So just generalizing AI is a really hard problem, and so that's what they focus on. So they released a science paper to show some of the value of what they're doing on a very different application. What they're focusing on is just the captcha. So text-based captcha has been broken in the past with neural nets, but it requires millions of training sets, training examples to get.
Right, it's really expensive to build it. Basically.
Yes, it's just not practical.
Right.
And also, captcha is moving on to more image-based and different challenges. What they were able to showcase is that with just a handful of examples, of systems, which is also neural net-based, but combines with other techniques such as, probabilistic models, but can now break captcha with very few training examples. And now one of the first applications they're going after is electronic assembly and packaging. So, this is
really tough.
Huge market. But where labor continues to be a big cost. And so for both an economic argument and a human argument, because some of these are not ergonomically nice jobs to have, is sitting and putting components on your PCB and at a good enough scale without losing accuracy, without making lots of errors. And today when your iPhones are assembled, it's actually 700,000-800,000 humans doing it, and then they want to replace that with more automated robots. So.
Awesome. So a question I'm really excited to ask you is, given your background in high-power compute systems, and I know we've both looked at a bunch of companies that are pushing better, faster, smarter, more efficient computation towards the edge. How do you think about that space, right? This is like the second coming of VCs investing in silicon.
Yeah.
We've done it a number of times now, and we have a bunch of capital piled in here. So I won't preach from on high about how I think it's a great idea, but I think given your background, what insights can you offer this room about what we should be excited about, what we should be looking out for, how defensible are any of these plays?
Yeah, so you're right. It's there's a renewed interest in VCs, capital being put into silicon, so hardware acceleration for both training and inference. There's this entire market which obviously NVIDIA is leading, and then Google's going after is more of the data center kind of applications. But I think more pertinent to industrial AI would be edge devices being smart around just inference at a really low power. And I think it's a really exciting space because sooner a lot of our the devices, everything is going to be connected, and you want them to be more intelligent. Some because of the bandwidth connectivity issues, some because of security issues, but you want these devices to be more intelligent. And I think there's a huge opportunity and a really large market if we can make it happen at that, within a limited power envelope of
That's
being
right.
smart, and the models can still get updated. There's a huge opportunity for a lot of different applications, and I think industrial AI is going to be one of the topmost beneficiaries.
Yeah,
of
it makes
that.
sense. To your points and to Mike's earlier points, it seems that these environments are so tough, and they're tough to get the right connectivity, and that the more intelligence data culling we can do in a constrained environment on the edge, the better our end systems
Absolutely.
will be.
Yeah.
How do you think, I don't know how many startups versus entrepreneurs versus scientists are in the room, how much should we count on those chips coming to market in a time frame that anybody in this room should care about? Or do we kind of continue building for our existing GPU, CPU, massive server rooms and hope that eventually we get some greater intelligence on the edge?
So the companies we are looking at and investing in, some which include the inference edge devices, they have to provide their own software stack so that you continue to program, whether you're using TensorFlow or any of your existing favorite frameworks, but they can translate it or compile it to their architecture. And so as developers, we shouldn't have to worry about compiling code to their architecture. You should just do it in whatever's the best framework available.
Right.
But it's on the startups or their ecosystem to develop the tools is required for compiling it to their architecture. And I think it's going to happen soon enough. Hopefully within the horizon investment, the investment horizons for us.
Right.
I'm excited about that space.
Yeah, likewise. So we're also coming up against 20 minutes, unless I'm way off on time, but somebody will pull a cane. We have about 5 minutes left. So a question I'm excited to ask you is, we hear all sorts of crazy stuff all day long. And sometimes it's from brilliant people, sometimes it's from very sincere wackos. And if you could offer one, right? Yeah, it's hard sometimes. But if you could have one piece of advice in terms of a pet peeve that when AI, whether they're industrial or generalized AI companies come and pitch to you, what's the one thing that they say that kind of makes you cringe a little bit or say just please stop, please stop with that sentence?
I think for me, it's going to be, when the third or the fourth slide on your deck has this cartoon image of a human brain, and they talk about, and we'll make AI happen, and it's going to mimic what the human brain does, and we'll get results. And I just pause there because I'm like, I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not a neurologist. I definitely do not understand how human brain works. Let's go specifically into the techniques you are doing and why that's better, and why is it beating everybody else out there, and why would you continue to be defensible? I'd much rather, and if I don't know it, I'll spend a day and a half to go read up about it and catch up to what you're doing, but do not come to me with saying, this is a human brain and we're going to do what a human brain can do. I don't have that knowledge today. So.
Yeah, fully agreed. So to any entrepreneurs or people who have entrepreneurs in their friends and family circles, please stop telling us that, because it's not a useful sentence, and it makes us question whether or not you understand the system you're building. To that point, how much does interpretability matter, right? In the industrial spaces, we have these big, complicated, safety, mission-critical, business-critical problems, and we want to employ these black box AIs. How do we think about understanding what they're doing, and does the next innovation of interpretable AI really matter?
I think it will matter. I think as researchers in the space, we're still trying to figure out what does interpretability and explainability of AI algorithms even mean. So we're still early on that side. So I can't say that it'll be one. Once we solve that, the world will all be smooth going, and there'll be no other challenges. It's not there yet. It should be helpful, but I think even before that, as and when we gain trust in these systems, you will just start believing them. If I know that implementing these ways of doing predictive maintenance is making my plant more operationally efficient. Even by a few percentage points, I may not have to worry about, do I trust this system, or can I explain every action out of it, and I'll just implement it. I think there are definitely applications out there where you want to know why a particular decision is made, but it may not go for every application. And like I said, it's very early for us to even define what explainability and interpretability of AI means. It'll take a while. I don't think that will be a stopgap for me, that until then I'm not going to implement and invest in any AI-based technologies. Absolutely not.
So that's an excellent segue into the audience question we have here, which is, if your point is that, look, just offer me a system that is provably better, and I don't care if I don't know what it's doing, as long as it is better, we'll use it. How do we then evaluate the claims of any of the startups, Vicarious included, that are claiming to be better at systems, where it's a crowded space, it's noisy, everyone wants to be better, and like, how do you, right? What does this question say? Basically, lots of people are claiming, particularly in electronics assembly and packaging, it's already a pretty tightly controlled process. Like, how does Vicarious go about, or any of your companies go about proving that they're making meaningful steps?
So Vicarious in specific is trying to show that their hypothesis is based on the techniques they're using without requiring too many training data, too much of the training data. They can still have a good enough outcome and high enough accuracy. So in general, if you look at robotics applications, whether it's in electronic assembly packaging or just like a picking robot, if you are not applying techniques like deep learning, which require a lot of data in general, you have to specify the sequence of actions, for a 360-degree turn, what needs to be done, in which order, et cetera. You have to give too many specifications to the machine. And that is typically not a scalable or economically viable solution. And that's why a lot of these tasks are still done by humans. You're putting something on a PCB or a breadboard, and say some configuration is slightly different, a human can make a judgment call right then and there, because they understand what the system is supposed to do, and they have a model of the world. And most robotic solutions don't have that model of the world. They just have a sequence of steps which are hard-coded, and they're just solving that. And if anything changes, pretty much the line stops, and it's not an economically viable solution at that point. So companies like Vicarious are showing that, no, that there is a model what their solution has of the world. And now with very little training set, they can still have an end-to-end model created. So it just depends on what is the primary ROI that you're going after, and what is the unique value proposition, and how you showcase that. And of course, for every startup, it's different. It's hard to answer that there's one way to solve all claims. It has to be based on individial startups' value proposition.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me, Kanu. It was such a pleasure having you.
Thanks, guys.
I'll see you soon. Awesome. So we've had a full morning so far with the investor points of view, and now we have the joy of switching over to the startups and the founder points of how do we actually push industrial AI forward, and rather than continuing to talk in generalizations, we get to now chat with some people who are building things. So my first guest on that front is, I'm going to butcher your name, but I'm going to try anyways. Karpagam Narayanan, who has been kind enough to allow me to use her Starbucks name, Kay. And so please welcome Kay, the co-founder of eKryp. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me here.
Let's just start off with, what is eKryp, this company that you founded, that you're, off to the races on? What are you guys building, and what made you excited enough to go do the scariest thing possible, which is found a startup?
Actually, my first startup was a scary thing, which was right out of the college, and it didn't go anywhere. So eKryp is the third one.
Awesome.
So when we were doing the previous startup, we worked with companies here. Amazon was the first customer. We built how do you take a hardware product down into the market, and how do you do new product introductions, et cetera. That's when we recognized there's a huge gap with respect to having a software company doing hardware, or a hardware company trying to get people things out into the market, and get insight into their supply chain, their service, their sales, and their product insight with respect to how a product functions in the market, right? So having done that for several different technology companies, we saw that gap, and we were trying to build a product using analytics. And while talking to customers, it became clear that we could use AI now with the computational power to do the same thing. So when we exited out of the company, this was just a natural transition to do that.
Awesome. Did you guys carry over is it literally the same team? I think this is a question that a lot of people ask and worry and think about, which is how do you pull qualified talent into AI startups, particularly in the industrial space, where you both need scientists, engineers, and some level of industrial knowledge. So, who are the people you're working with in this space, and how did you convince them to come join you?
So let me give a long answer to that question, right? So if you really think about the space, we used to call big data when we moved from 1 gigabyte of data to 1 terabyte of data. So this is not something that's new within the enterprise industry to call something big data. But the transition was happening with respect to platforms that are workflow-based, that are going into, and software that is analytics-based, that were sitting on top of the workflow platforms, to now intelligence being the platform. So once you have that kind of vision to do it, it was very, I shouldn't say it was very easy, but it was, all you needed to do is have people synchronize with that thought and have people work with you to say, okay, with intelligence being the right platform, how do we go ahead and disrupt the services industry, right? The enterprise services industry. Luckily, my previous co-founder and I, we are in it together, and Steve, who's the third co-founder, we had worked with him for decades together, and there were several people from the previous team who also bought into the vision, and we are doing this together.
Awesome. And so you call this you kind of
so sorry,
the
answer really is, I think we need to be clear with respect to what we are trying to achieve, and bring in people who believe the same thing.
Yeah, right. So every company, regardless of space, just needs to be mission driven. When you talk about kind of disrupting the services business and enterprise, and you specifically refer to eKryp as kind of being prescriptive.
Yes.
Which is a really interesting term, right? A lot of people use predictive, but prescriptive has a particular nuance to it. So could you kind of talk a little bit more about that? What does prescriptive mean for you in this space, and what are you being prescriptive about?
Exactly. So it is, I like to give this consumer example, right? So I love travel. I'm a travel addict. So if I look for airplanes, tickets, right? Several websites provide me with respect to, here are all the options for the cheaper tickets. But Southwest gives me a calendar with respect to when, what is, and Google Flights goes beyond it and says, hey, if you travel on Wednesday instead of Thursday, it is a little bit cheaper or whatever it is. So that's a little bit of extension in the consumer side. If you think about the same thing within the enterprise market, the reason I didn't bring an example, which I will, is in the enterprise market, these workflow examples are way more complex than the consumer market. But if you think about predictive is just knowing something, it's exactly the same as telling, hey, here are all the cheaper options for you to buy a ticket, right, to Dubai. But prescriptive exactly tells you what strategic decisions that you can make to optimize your business operations. That's how we differentiate predictive versus prescriptive. So what does it mean when it comes to enterprise services? So if there is an asset that's failing for a long period of time, and it's also bound to fail more, can I go ahead and should I be repairing it or should I refresh it, right? Who's the best person to fix a particular type of problem based on cost, skill set, geography, location, and various other factors? What could be the potential solutions to fix the problem? And since I exactly know what part within and what device is going to fail, why can't I feed it back into my logistics team to plan my inventory for the next 3 months or 6 months based on my lead time, right? So, since I know all of this, why can't I predict what my costs are going to be within my warranty life cycle, right? So it's really going into what are the big decisions that needed to be made within the service industry, and how do I go ahead and solve those or provide an answer for those questions?
So this is a beautiful vision, and it's tough to do this well across a bunch of areas. So are there a particular style of companies or a class of machines, or like how do you cull this into a tractable problem for a smallish company, early days, versus basically just saying we're going to solve everything for everybody and tell them how to run their businesses?
We don't. We do an enterprise service, and we've also focused on the manufacturing industry.
Got it.
Alone.
Any subset within manufacturing?
Good question. Currently, we don't have a subset.
Okay.
Because we have built a device ontology that would work, that has so far worked for routers, switches, imaging systems, huge point of sale systems, storage devices, etc. So we still haven't gotten to a point where we say, okay, we needed to, I think we go with highly complex, mission critical, uptime is critical, and high volume devices, and we rely on the device ontology to be able to have all our models predict. So the answer, we find the sweet spot between capital of the devices being around $150,000 to up to $2 million per device. That seems to be the sweet spot for people who want to adapt to something like this. I'm talking about the cost of the equipment.
Yeah, I understand that. So I guess my question there is that because at that point equipment is sufficiently valuable that it's actually instrumented with meaningful things that you can then do analytics on? Or because at that point that business has spent so much money on that piece of equipment that it's really business valuable for them? Or is it kind of the two?
We haven't seen the second portion. Actually, studies have shown for every dollar a company spends in product, they get around $8 in services, right? More and more manufacturers are looking into product as a service, and this is a market that is willing to do the cultural change with respect to, can I dispatch technicians way before equipment fails, right. Or can we? So I think do they have the right set of incident data and the device, some connected data? We don't even need it to be telemetry data. So connected data. So I think we look at it as a sweet spot with respect to this is the place that's ready because they have a huge capital where uptime is critical, right. And they are either worried about their SLA or OEE for their equipment, and they want to control their costs and see more revenue opportunities in the space. So, yeah.
Yeah. So
that may change.
It'll be interesting to see how that
may
shifts.
Change. Yes.
So to that point, which is that you're clearly solving a big problem for these customers, and you're kind of going after this holy grail, like we'll be prescriptive, you'll get ahead of it, you'll go send people to fix things before they actually break, right? Everything will run at beautiful efficiencies. How do your customers actually evaluate the return on investment of kind of pulling eKryp into the system versus just kind of operating at whatever their prescribed OpEx is?
So currently we have a ROI calculator that's outside of the product where we pull in and we say, okay, if it is incident, from a time a customer calls in for an incident to a time a call center rep, it takes 25 minutes. So how do I bring that down? How do I bring down my preventive maintenance schedule? How often does a field service technician go into the market and say, I can fix the problem, and how long does it take for them to fix a problem? If they are going to Palo Alto to fix a problem, can they fix everything around in the Bay Area? And what are the cost savings for that? What are the costs? So we look into each of those things, and we always tell our customers to start with one, because this is a huge thing. So pick one particular problem. They will either start with the incident, they'll start with the technician, or they'll start with the device, or they'll start with logistics. So, and again, in the logistics standpoint, how are they optimizing their spare parts and expediting spare parts to the sites where the field service technicians are. So we usually look at one portion of it and show ROI on that portion and then move into the next one. We want to build that into the product, and that's the next phase.
Makes sense. Yeah, so I'm going to ask a selfish question because I'm very interested, and hopefully somebody else in this audience will care, but offering a business service that helps your customer save money is great, but it's really hard to price. Because most people basically don't say, you saved me $60 million, so I will just pay you $60 million, right? It's really hard to do this. So how do you guys think about pricing as you're proving out the return on investment?
It is not straightforward as it used to be, especially with AI products, right? So,
because theoretically, you're getting better on every cycle of that.
And you can't, and you can't say, okay, the first time I ran the product, you know, I had 102% improvement. The next time it's less and less and less. So, are you going to price it? Yeah. So the way we price it is for every $100 that a customer pays for a capital equipment, there is around 30% that goes in terms of services. So we look at what is their, and usually around 60 to 65% is their actual cost, and remaining is their savings. So how much do we save from that? And we go based on capital equipment cost. That's kind of how we are pricing right now.
Makes sense. I guess a fundamental question I have in the space as a whole is people, I've been sitting on panels that they used to call these industrial IoT, now they call them industrial AI. But it's like for 5 years we've basically been talking, right? It's like all the same people in the same room talking in roughly the same words. And so I've heard the words predictive maintenance and prescriptive maintenance used over the better part of the last decade. So my question to you is why now? Like has there been a fundamental technology shift, improvement of data, or just market uptake that is going to make eKryp successful now? And why couldn't you have done this company 5 years ago?
You're talking to an entrepreneur who's always optimistic, but even today, there are 450 IoT platforms, so-called IoT platforms using AI, right? So there are a lot of people building platforms. We believe we want to focus on a solution and not build something that solves everything for everybody. But even there are people who think that it's still broad. So, right. But yes, we focus only on the area that we know, where we understand the pain points, where we know we can actually show ROI. So, and I truly believe, big decisions are getting made in companies. Even on the consumer side, if I'm driving from Palo Alto to San Francisco at 4 o'clock in the evening, what will the traffic be? I check, and I actually use data to make that decision. Should I leave at 4 or 4:30? But on the business side, we make a lot of decisions without knowing without actually using the data to make decisions. And that's the part I think it's going to get automated. And we picked one portion of it. And why now? Why not 5 years before? I think 5 years ago, we were still talking about, enhanced spreadsheet versions and business reporting, didn't we?
Yeah, exactly. My perspective is that 5 years ago, we were just worrying about connecting and collecting data, and now we can maybe do something interesting with it.
There is also an awareness of device manufacturers willing to move into the space, and they also understand, and they are being told, to their benefit, they are being told to go the IoT route, put in sensors, but they don't necessarily have to, is what our story is. Our story is as long as you are connected, studies have shown of the 100% of the data, enterprises use 1% of the data, where 33% can actually be usable. So we say, okay, we'll pick that 33% out of the 100% first before we tell you to go get that remaining 66%.
So a question that I have is, I kind of want to talk about the challenges that you guys have faced so far and will continue to face. And the perspective that I look at it from is, I used to work in aerospace and defense, and there was not a lot of willingness in that industry to, regardless of how brilliant and eloquent you are, to look at a startup like eKryp and say, yep, we're going to let you guys make any decision about us that's relevant. And so how do you get into these companies to the point of actually helping them make business decisions where they trust you? Is that a challenge you face at all? And how do you get over it if it is?
Humans, we people are always, we would be the last, cultural change is going to be the most toughest one. So you are bringing up exactly the right point, right? Cultural change is the most toughest one. So we go with the low-hanging fruit. Low-hanging fruits are, incident optimization, problem resolution. Those are low-hanging fruits. Then dispatching an engineer before a problem happens. But that too, since we show how your preventative maintenance goes down. So for example, we both bought a car from the same manufacturer, right? And the manufacturer says, go ahead and do an oil change every 3,000 miles. For your car, you may have to do 2,000 miles. For mine, maybe I have to do it every 6,000 miles. So device by device, it's different, right? And having that trust for that manufacturer to be able to go ahead and do that, that takes a little bit longer than the other parts with respect to the parts and the incident and the technician and all of those optimization. So we provide them the data. We start with something that they can get an ROI right from day one. And then slowly we allow, we are part of their digital transformation move. So we help them through that cultural process, through the digital transformation process. It creates stickiness for the company. So.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing that you need to build, right? It's not just getting in the door, but staying there. So given that we have such a phenomenal audience and we have some heads of industry in the space, and I'm sure people who would love to find an opportunity to work with you, and to the earlier comments that it's really hard to kind of, cull your customers early and figure out who's just kicking the tires versus who really wants to use an eKryp product and who will gain insight from it. How do you kind of think about your customer set, and what are the questions that you wish more customers would ask you? It's a tough question to throw out at the end with no prompt.
So it is, and one of the reasons we were actually, being in the technology industry for a long time, we are not people who went out and spoke in conferences, shared our knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. We started doing that because there was a myth that AI is only for the leading cutting edge companies, manufacturing companies, or you have to understand software within a manufacturing company. That's a tough one to be able to capitalize on it. So one of the reasons, why do you pick a project? How do you pick a project? What kind of data is really needed to pick a project is something I wish more people do ask that question. And one of the things that, I'll be talking in AI in the enterprise 2 days later with exactly the same thing. How do you pick an AI project? How do you pick an IoT project? How do you make money out of it, right? How do you measure your ROI out of it? And that's a fabulous conversation. We have started giving it out to the customers ourselves, and that's the reason for being in conferences and speaking about it too. I don't know, did I answer your question, Maryanna?
You did, and thank you so much for joining me today and for coming to these conferences. It's great to have you. So
thank you.
Everyone,
Thanks
thank
for
you to
having
Kay.
me.
Thanks. Awesome. Let's just stand for a second. It's a lot of sitting. So we're on to our my last victim this morning, which I have the pleasure of introducing Yvonne Wassenaar. Did I nail it? Yes, awesome. The CEO of Airware. And I think we have steps over here, so you don't have to go jumping over.
I was going to just walk right in front.
Awesome. Welcome.
Thank you.
So Yvonne is the CEO of a very cool San Francisco-based, I hesitate to call it a drone company because it's gone through some iterations, and so we would love to talk about that. But maybe we just start there. You have a really interesting background, so would love to understand a little bit more about you and what brought you to Airware.
Excellent. So we still call ourselves a drone company because drones are sexy. They are.
This person from aerospace, thank you.
I'm just saying, it brings out the kid in everybody. So work should be fun and drones are fun. So yeah, we're a drone company, but we're a drone analytics company. My background is a little curvy. I've done a lot of things from being a software engineer at Accenture out of undergrad, when I like to say COBOL was cool, to being, it's kind of funny, to being a strategy consultant for a long time in the tech space, working globally, helping companies expand with emerging technologies, more on the business side, really helping in the enterprise space, how to sell higher, how to sell value. Went from Accenture to VMware doing just that, going from virtualizing servers to looking at what's the software-defined data center, what is it, vCloud Air, a market we entered late, so we ended up divesting, was part of the pivotal divestiture. So I've done a lot of acquisitions, a lot of interesting things on that front. Ultimately went to New Relic to help take the company public. Fabulous cloud-based application performance monitoring, but really software analytics company at its heart. And ended up being CIO there, which was not an intentional career step, but a really informative one, and got involved in board work, which is how I met Airware. I interviewed for the board seat that John Chambers got. And I was excited. That's probably the only board seat I ever have not gotten I was excited about, because I'm like, I'm in the same sense as John Chambers. Now it serves me well because he's on my board, but ultimately a couple of years later, the founder, Jonathan Downey, who's an MIT aerospace engineer, he and I really got along, and he wanted me to help him scale the company, and eventually handed it over to me as we pivoted into software analytics.
Yeah, and I think that is such an interesting transition, especially to someone with your background kind of coming into a hardware, what was at some point a hardware company. So from what I understand, and it's naive and I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, is that really you guys kind of started as this software control stack for other people's drones to make them more efficient and better and do all sorts of interesting things, and then made the transition to being more of an end-to-end solution, and are now maybe even moving past the hardware, becoming a little bit more hardware agnostic to software analytics. So yeah. Is that a transition we should expect to see in AI companies that are trying to deploy on hardware? Or what have been the pivotal moments that have kind of forced those transition points?
Yeah, there's a lot in the question that you asked. So I'm going to take it kind of in two parts. One is, what does it take for an emerging market to emerge?
Right.
And a lot of what you see, if you look kind of historically at the path Airware has been down, is calling a new market super hard. And so, Jonathan had, I think, the brilliance to say, hey, there's drones being used for fun, there's drones being used for military, like what's in the middle? Can we create something in the middle? Right. And there's a huge amount of economic value to be delivered and hence gained in the company from attacking that middle piece. And I think the blessing and the curse is that the concept of a drone doing a, hail inspection on a 2-story steep, or even measuring a stockpile in a quarry or a mining site is so easy. Like, of course, why wouldn't you do that? And so I believe the reason the market's taken a long time to mature is that what was easy for us to conceive was hard for us to technologically deliver in the commercial space. Right. And I specifically say that because I come from a background in technology and working with servers and all that, and you talk about 5 nines. Like, you needed that level of reliability to put something in a business process. I was joking with somebody earlier, if you're flying a drone, taking pictures of the family at the reunion, like, if it doesn't work, it's fine. If you're going out and servicing a customer's need and they need to get their roof replaced, and you send somebody all the way out there and the drone doesn't work, or the drone runs it through the window, or the drone crashes, that's not okay. And so the hardware had to get more performant. The sensors the hardware carried, the image quality and the thermal imaging had to get better. And we had to couple that with the regulatory environments really becoming more permissive. So until August of 2016 in the US, you had to be a manned aircraft pilot to fly a drone commercially. So you could buy a drone off of Amazon and fly it for fun, which was great. But if you wanted to fly it commercially, you had to be a manned aircraft pilot. Really high bar to entry. And so fundamentally, we first had to get the hardware, the sensors, and the regulatory environments in the right spot for companies to start playing around. And then you need a certain amount of time for companies to play around before they actually say, yes, this is something I'll pay for. And so that's been kind of the backdrop to this 6.5-year journey we've been on. And in that time, to answer the second part of your question, what we realized, and this really resonates back to my background, it's super hard to be best of breed in hardware and software. It's a different mindset, it's a different culture, it's a different development cycle, and quite frankly, the technology is evolving so quickly. The problem that Jonathan was solving in the beginning about, the ability to easily, reliably fly drones was, subsequently solved by DJI. Right. And so we all of a sudden said, well, gosh, we're trying to solve a problem that somebody else has solved over there. They've got a lot more flight hours, on the hardware. They're proving that part of the problem. And oh, by the way, the real value is not in the drone. The real value is in the insights. And so what we focus on now is we focus on partnering with the leading innovators. It's still an emerging market, but the leading innovators on what I like to call digitizing the physical world. And that means turning, sites and structures into bits and bytes. And by doing that, we open up the power of everything that you guys know in technology. So we work with mining companies, construction companies, property management. If you look at the McKinsey reports, they're always like left behind. And they're left behind because I like to joke, like, how do you digitize dirt? You don't. But you actually can now because you can fly a drone really economically. You get images you stitch together into a 3D model. You all of a sudden have the X, Y, Z coordinates. You can do measurement. You can do collaboration. You can do all of these things. And oh, by the way, you can start to apply machine learning and AI. And you can start to integrate other pieces of data like telemetry data off of Caterpillar machines or blasting plans, things like that. So that's when it gets interesting. So we've said, gosh, we'll let our customers pick whatever hardware they want. We're focusing on the ingestion of the imaging and the other sensory data and everything you do after that, which I think is super exciting.
That's a really interesting point, right? Because basically what you're saying is that in this industry, like nobody thought it would be true again, but flight heritage matters again. And even though they're all cheap plastic drones, the cheap plastic drone that's flown the most is the best cheap plastic drone. And it sounds like that's going to carry across. So, Ray, whether it's maybe all the driverless car companies should not worry about building driverless cars, but should go find car platforms that know how to withstand accidents. To that point, if we just pivot the conversation towards looking at the industrial space broadly, is that a pattern we should expect, that the hardware will just always get commoditized, and if you're working on it, you better be a big manufacturer, likely in China, with access to a big long-tail manufacturing end if you want to go that, because being 3DR again is a bad plan in this market.
Yeah, so I think there are two plays to consider and some guide rails that will separate the winners from the losers. The two plays to consider is I believe in most of the hardware spaces you will find the big player, the economy of scale player, the person who has the most flight hours. That's DJI in this case. They're lowering the cost of entry. They're creating some great technology that's good enough for many of the business needs we want. I will say there are some niche opportunities. So there are companies that are creating fully autonomous drones that are super expensive, but if you look in the mining space, the holy grail is getting to the fully autonomous mine.
Right.
And so they're willing to pay, $100,000 for the concept of not having to put a person there to fly the drone. And so I do think there will be opportunities for niche players that are solving very specific problems. But that's tough because you have to pick a market that's big enough to really justify that. But I think you'll have those two things. To me, what's most important on either side that you're playing is really being open. Like, I deeply believe the future of technology is evolving so quickly that everybody needs to think about how open is your solution. Nobody's going to create the complete thing. We're not creating the complete thing. Ultimately, you want open APIs, you want the ability to integrate, you want the ability to enhance and to really augment and take what you're doing to the next level, and quite frankly, encourage other people to consume what you're building.
Right. So to your earlier point, when we were chatting earlier, we were joking that, the question in the commercial drone space is like, why is this taking so long? Like, we've been talking about drones for a while, and it sounds like the answer is there's the trifecta of risk here, right? There's technology risk on the reliability front. There's market risk on once we develop a product, how on earth do people use it? And so I want to talk a little bit more about that. And there's the regulatory risk, which is a little out of our hands, but we can be good stewards.
We influence it.
Yeah, right? So I think that's a really interesting point to bring up, which is AI companies are entering challenging markets, and they need to be good stewards of the regulatory body. So what has Airware done particularly well to help influence and kind of create a rising tide for the rest of the drone market?
Yeah, so Airware has always been very involved on the regulatory front, and we actually have a regulatory expert on staff, somebody who was at the FAA for 7 years. And that's what he does. He specializes in that. He goes to all the various meetings on regulations, and right now we're focused on beyond visual line of sight and multiple drones per flight operator. What's interesting in the regulatory space, I had the opportunity to go to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, as a tech pioneer. And there was a lot of conversation on regulations globally. Because what's fascinating and also what's challenging is if you're building solutions and you're selling to a global marketplace, when you have different regulatory requirements in every single market that you're at, or if you're a business and you have regulatory constraints in different markets where you perform, that creates a lot of loss and a lot of friction. So it was fascinating and really encouraging for me to hear the Secretary of Transportation for the US, who I was on a panel with, say, the US has been behind, and we will, we passed Part 107, we're looking at other things we can do, but we have got to progress regulation to ensure that our country stays competitive. And to me, it was a really, I think, important shift in mindset. The regulations exist because we want to ensure that people are safe. We want to ensure our communities are safe. I mean, they're trying to do good things. But finding agile approaches and ways to pursue that is important. So we participate in those different forums. We work with the World Economic Forum. They've got a group pulled together of various different executives in the drone space to really help influence regulations on a global basis. And I think being open-minded, appreciating their challenges, but helping educate. And as the technology becomes better, the risk that's to be faced is less. So I always use the analogy of, hey, if you can send somebody to inspect a pipeline and, say, 2 out of 1,000 times, or sorry, 10 out of 1,000 times they get hurt. And you can fly a drone to do the exact thing, and less than 1 time out of 1,000, somebody gets hurt. Which is better? And people are dying inspecting pipelines, and they're falling through roofs. Like bad things are happening to people, and so I do think the bar for technology is higher. You have to be much, much better before you switch. But I do think there's an increasing openness of, hey, we have to learn to embrace the technology, and so we try to be empathetic, but also educational and a little pushy.
That's right, and that's kind of that trade-off between offering reliability in a system works versus innovating, potentially offering something better, but it might fail in some catastrophic way. To that point, how do we think about Airware as an AI company, right? Because you guys started as a control stack, like a closed-loop control stack for drones, which I would argue is specifically not AI, right? I come from very much that class of robotic controls where you're like, let's not throw questionable things up in the sky and see how they crash. So you guys started.
I appreciate that. I'm like, as somebody who walks around this earth, I'm glad things aren't falling and hitting me.
Right, I know. I was at CMU, not MIT, but there's similar approaches. And so if we think about the fact that you guys started as a closed loop control stack, now you're doing this kind of analytics piece, like where are the fundamental points of AI coming in? Like how do we think about Airware as an AI company?
Yeah, so I have a confession to make. We're not really an AI company. We're in Silicon Valley. I would say, in fairness, we do more machine learning than we do true AI by how somebody who's educated at MIT might define the term, as my dear friend Buddy tells me all the time. It's like, Yvonne, that's not AI. I'm like, from a market perspective, it is. It's the pixie dust.
That's right.
That said, we're using it. Yeah, we're using it. We're using deep learning technologies. We're using simulation libraries. We're using TensorFlow. We're using all those technologies on what seemingly are very basic tasks, but they add a lot of value. So some examples. One is when the difference, people ask me, like, why didn't you just use a satellite? Satellites are getting better. Satellites are getting better, and microsatellites will get really good imagery for some use cases, like catastrophic response. However, what we do and what we leverage the drones for is to create 3D models, because then you get the elevation as well as everything else. And so you need overlapping images of a certain quality to stitch together to create a 3D model out of static images. Now, when you do that, you can use something called RTK technology, but many sites still use what we call ground control points.
That's real-time kinematic for anyone who's
Thank you for that.
wondering what. We've been throwing a lot of acronyms out this morning, so I'm sorry for everyone who's.
Yeah, I apologize. But basically, so one thing we use is we actually use deep learning technology to identify these ground control points, which is really just big red and white checkers on a large construction site or mining site to help the software know how to stitch together the imagery effectively. Sounds really boring, but dramatically increases the SLA and the quality that gets to the end customer. We do more exciting things, like because, again, we have elevation change, we've been able to do hydrology analysis using GIS simulation libraries. We've been able to create flood maps that are much more accurate than FEMA. We've been able to help construction companies understand where pooling and things might happen. We've started to do, we use deep learning to actually help us out on thermal analysis and on potential water damage. And so we can do thermal scans of rooftops, and we can actually identify where water may have penetrated and be, potentially something that needs to be addressed. And so we've used, another thing we've done that's really cool is we use segmentation to actually identify like where haul roads are or a high wall. So if you're driving around a mine, the height of a wall can only be so high before it's at risk of falling. And we can now, rather than drive around with a truck and a pole sticking out of it to ensure compliance, we can actually use machine learning to determine and actually segment out where the high walls are and where the haul roads are and things like that. So we use machine learning right now really to help us much more quickly than a human ever could identify, segment out, identify changes over time. We do automated damage detection. We do fragmentation of rock analysis post-blast. So just to make all of those things more efficient. Over time, where we see it going really is more into the predictive space.
Right.
So integrating in, for example, weather patterns, historic rooftop wear, what the current analysis shows, and therefore when you might want to go repair a roof or how you might want to manage your capital expenditures if you're a large property management company.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to that future, and I also look forward to when it stops being the fairy dust that we use as a marketing term.
At least I was honest.
Yeah, no, I would have called you out otherwise on it, so I am thankful for that. But to let people go shortly, because we're stopping, I think we're the last barrier between them and more food and coffee. A particularly challenging question to end on is what's next, right? Like Airware has been through this whole interesting path, and you as well in your career. So, what is the next 5 years of Airware or Yvonne at Airware look like? And where do you want to push this company?
Yeah, so what we're really looking to do is to build out a lot of what I just talked to you about. So the markets are just hitting their inflection points. We're going from innovation groups into scale out. And it's really exciting to see, people en masse starting to consume what we've been building for a long time. So, one is we're going to continue to ride that wave. And I always tell the engineers, like, you can build the next shiny thing, but let's make money on what we've already built. Let's not forget that. So really scaling that out and having that globally enterprise class is super important. But the things that we're innovating on really are in that direction. One, we're starting to go down the predictive route with some of our customers on the innovation roadmap. We're starting to integrate different data types. So we've integrated LiDAR data, obviously thermal data. We're looking at sonar. So what we really believe is we're kind of basically creating digital twins and 3D reality models that allow people who manage the physical world to do it in a very, very different, innovative way. And so what you'll see us doing fundamentally is two things. One, integrating different data sources to further enrich that, be them different data streams or different sensory data. The other thing that you'll do is see us following my own advice, which is really creating an open platform that allow people to do some development on top of what we do to further enrich it and to integrate into other people's solutions.
Well, I look forward to that future and to seeing Airware lead the way on that path. So thank you so much for joining me this morning. And thank you all.